Welcome to the sneak previews along the way to modernized architecture in Tridion Docs session. So I will be hosting this session today. I'm Dave de Meijer. I'm working from the Belgian office and I'm a development manager on the Tridion product line. Also already a system architect for quite a while. And some of you might also know me as an ish remote maintainer, the open source library. So what will we try to cover in this session? Two parts. I will give a heads up on what we are working on for the next release of Tridion Docs, with highlights mostly on the content manager side, and show you the things we already did, what we still try to achieve, our runway. The second part will be some more in-depth about Ish Remote, the open source library, which is on top of the API. First part will be about what is available right now, and then some ideas and a working prototype, a glimpse into the future. Along the way, I think we are relying on some giants, some products we also rely on in turn. Think about database engines, but also our middleware. There is middleware that is quite respectful and has done a lot of great work called component services, Complus technology. Along the way came Microsoft with the full .NET framework. And then you heard things about .NET Core, which is these days branded as .NET in general. Those are middleware platforms that we rely on and that we build on. And that has an effect on us. So if I tell you a bit about the history of the API, the Tridion Docs API, then we try to version it, but versioning is a complex thing. The first version we shipped, and after a while we saw that the version numbers are not always numbers, so we made them strings, which is the simplest change, but it is a breaking change, and that's where API 2.0 came from. API 2.0 is one we have maintained for many, many years. And because of that middleware change, we moved from the Complus technology world into the .NET framework world. And we really wanted to keep functional backward compatibility. So we call it the 2.5, like a 2.5. So it had all of the notions of the version 2, but it was no longer relying on Complus technology. It was built on .NET technology. Of course, you still had to rewire a bit of the code, but it was mostly the same function definitions, and it really came down to some numbers in a string. This is the API we use ourselves in Publication Manager, Authoring Bridge, Translation Organizer. This is our public API that you all know. That's also hinted on the top left. This is the history. This is what is currently available to all of you. Still, we are moving from Complus technology into the .NET world. Our approach was to do vertical migrations, which means that we did full stack migration. So we didn't do a layer per layer, but we did functionality. And I think a lot of the green boxes here on the screen were functionality, which we did along the way. Some of you might remember a document object that gave you like 4 or 5 times speed improvements because of the complete rewrite. But we still have 2 boxes left that we need to work on. One is inboxes and the other one is reporting. And they're mostly visible, I think, in the web client and a bit in the client tools. That is still work in progress. An API is not only about functionality and business compatibility on how things work, but you also need to think about the communication protocol and the security protocol. On the picture on the right, you see our main layering of the application, where the bottom layers are typical data layers and core and business and plugins configuration. But then top right, you see an API 2.5 assembly layer that can be used in plugins. And on top, there is a a communication antenna, and that is built in ASMX. That was the original API we offered in what was called SOAP 1.1, and it uses direct authentication. Direct authentication because the CMS itself was responsible for authentication using username and passwords. Later on, we introduced the indirect authentication over standards like Oasis WS Trust and WS Federation. That required a version bump in the communication protocol. We went to SOAP 1.2 using security headers, and that is what we enabled. But as you can see in the picture, layering wise, they are ASMX and WCF are actually the same. They have a different authentication mechanism, but they are still using the same XML models. So those ish objects and ish fields as parameters in the functions, most of them all simple types. So they can be used, and that gave a certain kind of compatibility as well moving forward. The whole picture on the right is hosted in .NET Framework 4.8. And there is again a change worth mentioning because .NET Framework 4.8, the Windows framework, has been announced by Microsoft of being the latest stable version that they will ship. It is tightly connected to the Windows operating system, so I would not worry about it being gone in the next 10 years. But still, it says something on where they want to head, and in turn, that they are working on an alternative. Their alternative, which they initially pitched as .NET Core, these days is called .NET 6. That middleware is now more cross-platform, so not a Windows-only thing. It does, however, have a side effect for us that it doesn't support that WS Trust security protocol anymore. And that has a ripple effect throughout our whole stack. Also, a nice to know is that Windows PowerShell 5.1 relies on the full .NET Framework 4.8. The newer versions of PowerShell, which you can run on Linux and Mac, they actually, behind the scenes, rely on .NET Core or .NET 6. So people that want to run certain libraries, they all need to be written in the .NET 6 style. So some insight of things that are changing in the world around us. For your convenience, still a table. They have a different support policy. So very recently they released .NET 6.0, and that is going to be supported for 3 years. But they will, every other release is a new long-term service release. And yeah, in the end, it's also about people. That is our own engineers, customer support, partners. Everybody wants to use the latest tooling, and yeah, the tooling gets better around these new platforms and not necessarily around those older platforms. So the things we have lined up are to get rid of that COM+ technology. That is the technology which still mostly powers the classic ASP, what most of you know as the web client. The classic ASP has some issues by itself because it mixes business logic and configuration. It is a little bit more tricky and expensive to fix security issues, although we are having the highest level of security policy reached for the Tridion Docs application. And it complicates some other stuff. COM+ technology forces us to go to full Windows.NET Framework. In turn, that blocks us a bit moving forward, going cross-platform and all that. It's not a lot like a one-stop thing, but we still have some time to go, and we would like to evolve in that direction. Definitely an important piece of this thing is that because we are doing virtual migration, remember that picture with a lot of green boxes and still a couple of red boxes left, that we have two data layers going into the database. One is Com+ oriented and one is .NET oriented. And we would like to get rid of that second data layer because, yeah, mixing two technologies means that you have to keep in mind some database locking paradigms or limitations. So we have some nice ideas for optimizations, but it's a lot easier if you only have to take one data layer into account, let alone if you ever want to switch from to a different database engine. Then one data layer really makes it a lot easier. In those vertical migrations, if you really scratch the surface in the web client, then you could already see those. We did property screens, settings areas, event monitor, users, user groups. Those were all written in more contemporary technology over the years, ASP.NET. And it's now we're at a moment in time that we need to bite off a bigger chunk. And that's what you see on the bottom right. That's a screenshot of what we call organized space, the successor of the web client. It is indeed a new technology, a new framework, and it will become the leading UI framework. And some of the ASP.NET technology will be blended into that, but along the way, we'll drop that classic ASP notion. So to support that new organized space, we definitely wanted to have a proper REST API available. And that is a change we already wanted for a while. That proper REST API will be built on OpenAPI. It's what some of you also know as Swagger. It will live next to the others. So you see that we reuse the whole bottom layer of the application, business, plugins, data layers. We will introduce a new API 3.0 assembly because we're stepping away from the XML models. So each object, each fields are really going to become nicer data contracts, which allow client generations and more. We'll also have a more graceful solution for multi-value, the infamous DDMM YYY date format. That's all something we take into account. So also time zones are part of that. So you see that new third column there with an OpenAPI antenna. That piece will start hosting in .NET 6. That also means because we're having side-by-side .NET Framework and .NET 6, that all of the bottom layer needs to be in .NET Standard 2.0, which is a contractual agreement that both runtimes can run those assemblies without worries. Of course, when you introduce a new communication protocol, you can imagine that we're also looking for a new security protocol, and that will be something around modern authentication. So on the left, a screenshot where we are with some Swagger documentation. So everything what you expect these days around self-documenting API calls. I'm not really highlighting that piece. What I can highlight, how we see it, is that we will offer an internal private open API service, and that is what we call the V0. It will be the same quality as what we will later call the public API, but we're not necessarily guaranteeing cross-product version compatibility. It is an API that serves our purposes, so support organized space, the collective spaces, and we need the ability to change something when we need to. There is a sibling, and that is what we call the version 3, so API 3.0. That is the one that we guarantee public API service across product versions. So just like API 2.5 and 2.0, you didn't have to recompile your application for every product release. It could work for multiple versions without a change. And that is something that will happen. So OpenAPI is coming. Now a picture to reset your mind, and I'll try to summarize what we're doing so far. Application interfaces are very important these days to integrate with all kinds of services, components, automation, anything goes. We had a nice API in older Complus technology, and we moved into the .NET framework world. That was API 2.0. Next, we'll have an API v0 coming in the next Tridion Docs release. That is our attempt to prove that it all works, that it supports what we need to do. And probably the release after that will make several of those API functions public in a nice contemporary full stack .NET 6 environment with models allowing client generation for the Javas and the Pythons and the .NETs of this world to integrate with. What I really want to ask all of you is make sure to write your plugins and handlers in .NET Standard 2.0 because it is already working on your current version and it will improve the migration path going forward. That's the first part. If I now go into that second part and give you an update on Ish Remote, then Ish Remote is a PowerShell library that is written in C#. On top of that, WCF SOAP API, the current public API. For that, you're using tools like Windows PowerShell, so on the .NET framework, or Windows ISE. So what does that look like in the same picture? Well, the current version of Ish Remote, all of the 0.x versioning is on top of WCF. Let me first give you a quick introduction, and I'll switch screen for that. This is Windows PowerShell ISE. It's the integrated script editor, which from a Windows PowerShell 5.1 point of view is the easiest way to get to know PowerShell and to work with it. And what does PowerShell do? It is a very easy way to do automation and connect things which are useful for you, but are not necessarily standard product because you want to achieve something. It is not only about Tridion Docs. This can also be about other systems or operating system. There are a lot of libraries available. We offer Ish Remote on the PowerShell Gallery, which is a store offered by Microsoft where you can easily install from. And then it all starts with generating a session to the web services. So typically this is the same URL you will fill in into the publication manager, for example. And then there are a couple of ways for credentials. I will start a session and log in to this machine. And then I have my session and it shows me that I'm on a certain URL with a certain username, certain Ish Remote version, and this is a 14SP4 server version. There are some generic commandlets that say what are the functions, commandlets that are available in a certain library. Outgrid view is a thing I often use to highlight that there are better ways to show information with a nice filterable screen. That is also part of PowerShell default. There is a get help for every one of those. So you can use the help viewer on the right. And then on the new session, you can see the parameters, and at the bottom you see examples of all kinds, and that goes for any of the commandlets. So if you have a session, and in behind the scenes in this process I have an Ish session available, even if I didn't assign it to a variable. It gives you some extra hints. So for example, if I start typing, then I get hints on the fields which are in the repository. So that is a nice thing to have as well. Some highlights of changes that happened in the last year and a half or something. That is around annotations, things which are visible in the commenting area of draft space and review space. So this is, for example, list me all publication outputs for this GUID, and I'll close the site view so that you have a little bit more screen. So here you see information from all of these publications that are in the CMS. If I pass those out to get annotation, I actually get a grid view again that shows me annotations in this system. And there are also other ways to do it on objects or something like that. But there is a nice filter here that I can, a commandlet called export Excel, offered by a module called import Excel. What's in a name? And if I show you that, then it actually gives that result. And instead of printing it here, it actually pushes it all in an Excel file. And you get all of the properties on those objects loaded. And from then on, you can imagine that you can do more filtering. Another thing that was made a little bit easier in the latest version of this remote is a way to walk a folder structure. I think initially a lot of people did the find operation, which, depending on your criteria, just returns the full repository, which can be on some sizes of repository kind of painful because you're loading everything into memory. But this one allows to walk a folder structure and, yeah, in this one, give you one result. It's just my luck that there is only one object still checked out in that folder structure. So you could pass a certain filter, retrieve some metadata, and this is the new piece for a certain folder. Only return me folders of a certain type, and recursively, and then for every one of those returned folders, get me the folder content, and again filter to versions or to certain languages. With the metadata filter, you can really pinpoint it. And then at this moment in time, you can do whatever you want. You can start to create a report. You can do a legacy conversion. There are plenty of possibilities here. Another change or extension that was done is smart tagging. There was always the call get each type field definition. It returns you what is available in your repository regarding object types, fields, and levels and types. It really gives you a lot of information, but we now extended it with metadata binding as a type, which means it returns you if a certain field on a certain level is configured with a certain data source, and this is configured in the settings area, one of those connectors. And if that connector is capable of doing smart tagging, you get an extra T present. So it's create, read, update, search, as in full text index, and tag from smart tagging. But there are, again, plenty of filters that if you want to find something out or you're looking for a certain field that has check, of course, nothing here, but here you see the checked out or checked out by field. So you can look it up, find exact spellings and more like that. Last interesting piece here is the search. There is a simple query search that allows you to do the syntax, which you can do also in the user interface. If I show you this on the system, it actually does a search, and then it, in groups of 999, it will retrieve objects. So these are the first 999, and then in a moment the scroll bar will move again, and then you see a scored list. But again, you can push it into an Excel file. You can do further processing with it. So that's all possible. There is also a count parameter, which doesn't retrieve the full data set, but just tells you there are 2,108 hits. To connect the dots, the above piece is a simple query, and you can imagine that it is possible to keep compatibility there, even if we go to OpenAPI. But there was also a rich one I added. And this is an example of such those XML containers that we have to give assignments to the code on what needs to happen. So this is a query for all versions with a very specific syntax on Boolean logic, how to sort the result, any filters that need to be applied. And if we push that in a search and catch the result in an isObject variable, then we can do further processing on it. But this is a thing, this XML structure is not guaranteed to be around anymore in the new OpenAPI. So if we look at, for example, the first array object in this list, then you see that as a search result. If you want to see more, then you pass it on to format list and you get all kinds of information and so on. I will now jump back to the presentation. These are more reference slides now because the demo worked, but I talked about annotations. I gave some insights on walking a folder structure and avoiding the massive find me everything call. The changes we did on the ish type field definition extension. So that's something I showed. It also shows you the domains, the list of values are in there. And then the search, the simple search, the rich search that we potentially cannot keep compatible, and the count option. And now I'm bringing the presentation into what is now next for ish remote. Well, that middleware all changed, and there are already some requests like, can we run ish remote on PowerShell 7? So it's an investigation on what can we do in this new world. And we did some work across the past year to, well, find out what was the best way possible. And we chose this direction because it gives already some early value to any existing customer. So we're branding it ish remote version 7. It matches with the PowerShell version 7. But this library works also still on Windows PowerShell. There is one thing that does not work anymore. Like the original ish remote, as you see in the picture, was built on WS Trust for security. For now, the new one we will build again on ASMX, because ASMX is supported in .NET Core or in .NET 6. So we can really have side-by-side implementations, the tests that we move forward. End result is a ish remote version 7 library that uses the older direct authentication. So you need a username password in the CMS repository. But once it's shipped, it actually works for all of you, even should work on Linux and Mac. So that is nice. If I show you that in a picture, then it's actually this guy. And I now need to copy. Well, I first show you, this is my development version of it. But what is the trick of this library is that the main module file of this package will decide if it will launch a .NET 4.8 version of the ish remote code or a .NET 5 version. But all of the test framework is kept the same. So you get the same results, the same formatting, the same help, everything is there as you know it. So if I load that in PowerShell 7, as you can see at the top here, lost my keyboard. Yeah, lost it again. So if I'm loading that here, it loads the library, and Now I do a login to that same system. And in here, I'll zoom a little bit out. You can see that it's a 7 version of Ish Remote, and there are 15 that I'm connecting to a 15 system with success from inside PowerShell 7.2, which is now .NET 6 enabled already. Same thing here, it's still PowerShell, so you still have your get help on new ISH session. So that's all there. If you want to see the examples, that all works. Everything is there as you saw it before. Yeah, there is a learning curve. There's a nice file on GitHub, a Markdown file that tells the story a bit on the struggles, but that's more the learning curve for us or for myself. I think the most important bit for you guys to know is that a typical PowerShell testing framework is Pester, and we moved to Pester version 5.3, but all versions of Ish Remote, the current 0x version line or the 7.0, they use the same test set. So in that sense, we can guarantee compatibility, or if we need to break, then we also know pretty certain where we are breaking and why we are breaking. I think that's the most important bit. We have an integrated build system set up and all that, but that's less important. So if we now give a hint into the future, well, same picture again. What if we can do Ish Remote based on that new open API? For now, internal development, we added basic authentication to that open API endpoint. That's not the way we're going to ship the product, but it does allow us to test the functional compatibility. And if we look at that in the code, really, then the idea is to have side-by-side implementation so that they serve a bit as code example. So at the top here, you see ASMX code. This is a typical application 25 login call that returns authentication context, product version, and we're off. And then next is an open API basic authentication call. Because basic authentication is on every request, we're just passing it on the HTTP client. But then again, we're still retrieving the version here and returning the same end result of this commandlet. And that's how we will prove from our end that we are really keeping compatibility, a path forward for any custom implementation in mind. We see the problem ourselves by Ish Remote, but also by Publication Manager, and we try to catch weird stuff as early as possible so that you guys don't have to catch it. So that brings me to my second and last relax point. So what are we working on? Well, we're working on organized space. That is our first milestone. The replacement of the web client and on a private open API, but we are already proving it in tools like Ish Remote. After that, we'll open up open API into a public version with modern authentication and rewire all of the client tools. And when we're on modern authentication, which is a more browser-based style of authentication. Currently, if you log into Publication Manager, it really shows you a login dialog, and it cannot handle a redirect to an MFA, so to a multi-factor system. So that's a change we still need to do. And along the way, step away from COM+ technology, and even where we can, we will step away from .NET Framework into the .NET world. If there are any questions, I'll keep an eye on the chat. And of course, I think several of you already know where to find me on the community or the open source project, or drop me an email. I think that's it. Thank you.